Arnold to Münzer and Yates, how steroids went wild, a continuum of 3 eras. I see this in 3 segments. Starting off with bodybuilding in the 1970s into the 80s, I call it the Arnold Era. So does everyone else. Late 1980s into the 90s, the blast and cruise era. And then around 2000 up to today, presently, is definitely where bodybuilding came out of the underground and into the business world. Starting off with Arnold's old school era, the 1970s into the 80s, let's talk about the steroid patterns. Back then, men were really cycling steroids for about 8 to 12-week cycles and no more than 2 times a year. Let's get right into the drugs, because that's really the piece that everyone's looking at. Over this continuum, over decades, the drug use is just picked up and just multiplied upon itself. Here's what these guys did back in Arnold's era when they were on steroids. It was testosterone esters, of course. The dose ranged from about 250, old school, Sustanon 250 per week, up to maybe 750, maybe a little bit more, but it was limited duration. Next, the oral drugs, of course, and the intermuscular add-ons, Anavar. That's the day when they started using about 20, 40, maybe 60 milligrams per day, and they kept it tight up. They kept those orals down to like 4 to 6 weeks or even less. Of course, on bulking cycles, Dianabol was used, and that was 10 to about 50 milligrams daily. And the add-on drugs that we know were used in addition to the testosterone esters were Winstrol, sundry doses, Decadorabolin injection, sometimes used by itself. Primobolan was a classic used with testosterone. Now, back then, there was a limited or almost no use of aromatase inhibitors, but I know, guys, I know that in this time period, it was starting to be used by some people, but it wasn't really relied on and used that often. There was no or very limited insulin use in the 70s into the early part of the 80s, and very limited growth hormone and no IGF. And there was really no use or limited use of diuretics. Now we move forward into the late 80s and into the 90s. I call this the blast and cruise era. No question at this point, everything's multiplying, drugs are adding up, and with that, guys were not coming off so much. So testosterone esters, now we're seeing guys move up to about 1,000 milligrams a week. I know even during this time period, guys took more, but if you really go back and look what's going on during the 80s into the early part of the 90s, they were still keeping a lot of these drugs kind of limited, but at this time, they were definitely blasting and cruising. A lot of the guys, because of the drug use, they just couldn't come off, and they were cruising on lower doses of testosterone. That's that 1 cc a week of Sustanon 250. I've heard it from guys that are even still around today that are lucky to be healthy, and they're, boy, older than me. You know, they're in their 60s and 70s, some of these guys. Now, here are the other compounds that were used. Just like in the prior era, there are bigger doses of Dianabol, bigger doses. Some guys are using 80 milligrams of Dianabol, Anavar up to over 100 milligrams of Anavar, Winstrol, Decadorabolin, Equipoise coming more into play during this 80s, 90s, or it's more into the 90s, I think. Trenbolin, Parabolin coming into play here, again, overlapping with the time in the era before, maybe a little bit. Insulin starting to be used into the 90s. GH becoming available through some recombinant processes, so it's more the availability is becoming more an option for men to use. And then into the 90s, you start seeing diuretics, clenbuterol, thyroid, and the beginning of considering to use post-cycle therapy. And then on March 14th, 1996, a man named Andreas Münzer dies from complications of what seemed to be a peptic ulcer. You could see my video on that. The judging criteria is starting to change. The judges from the classic era of even the 60s and 70s into the 80s, now heading into the 90s, they're accepting this morphing, if you will, into the symmetry's there, but they're bigger. They're heavier on stage. It's almost like the judges are really loving this and knowing what's going on, because a lot of the judges have been competitors. We know this. I'm not a bodybuilder. I'm a power lifter, but I'm certainly an historian of this stuff, being 58 years old right now and interviewing so many great guys like this that have been around back then, and so many of you that are so on point with the history of what's going on during these times. So the judging criteria, I think, is really starting to change at this point, no question. And Andreas Münzer, he was known to be blasting and cruising using prep drugs, drugs that are classically much more limited in the era before because they knew they were toxic. He was staying on them longer, and also with other drugs, the injectable steroids as well, and also thought to have been utilizing diuretics. Now we're starting to get into some of these really serious complications, and of course, this man's death. That's the turning point for me in this late 80s and 90s, heading into modern bodybuilding. Now we move along to the current modern era of bodybuilding, around 2000 to present, to today. Today is 2023. We have a massive epidemic of steroid use and PEDs. It's not just steroid use, it's performance enhancing drugs. It's not just men, it's women, and it's spread most commonly into the average person. And now the media is on board, and I'm glad they are. I just want them to be respectful and to understand this has been going on for a very long time, and there's a lot of moving parts on this. So in this last modern era that is unfortunately morphing right in front of our eyes, I call this the blast and cruise on steroids era. This is bodybuilding out of the underground, and now we are into business, guys. Back in the day, bodybuilding was a calling and a culture, and the guys were broke. They would drive. I know guys that did it. They would drive to LA. They would drive to LA broke and living out of their cars just to lift. Of course, doing some steroids just to be part of it, man. And they knew they weren't going to go pro. They just were doing it just for the adventure and just for the culture, just for the feel. We lost that with this morph and all these drugs and now the danger. This also, in this era, without question, is social media on steroids, or steroids on social media. Because of this, guys, because of this, and there's no blame. It's the nature of the modern beast. It's the good and the bad, blessing and the curse. This is what's happened. The common man and woman has access to understanding how to use the drugs and, of course, the drugs themselves. Let's talk about the drugs now. So, testosterone esters, you see this? Always a base. The esters now, around 2000 to today, now we hear, I remember it, I can't believe it, hearing guys coming in 3 grams a week, 3 cc. Remember the guy, 3 cc? Trenbolone. Trenbolone's really playing a bigger role, also parabolone for a short period, but it's tren. There's different types of tren. You can see the videos on that. Up to 750 to a gram a week. This is on top of all the other drugs, on top of testosterone. Now we have Anavar, still strong, 100 milligrams plus a day, certainly 80, Equipoise, Winstrol, and then the insulin. 3 times a day insulin, at least twice a day. Regular guys, high school kids and college kids, regular guys getting into it, taking testosterone, oral steroids, and then the average guys using insulin. Of course, GH, and now Around this time period, maybe in the last 10 or 15 years, depending on how much money you have or who's supporting you, and that's why it's a business now, real IGF, which to me is so mysterious because it's so expensive and it's like, who really gets it and does it really work? And another serious add-on that we see today, started back in this era, diuretics, no question, diuretics. Pre-prep show diuretics have hurt a lot of people, including women. Clenbuterol now coming more into play in those last 20 years or so, not to mention 10 years. And I know it was used before, guys, but there's nothing like we've seen the last 10, 20 years. Thyroid preparations. Now, you ask about PCT, post-cycle therapy. Post-cycle therapy now, classically, is not used really to get guys natural testosterone endogenous androgens back on board because they blast and cruise and they know it's really not going to happen. They may try to do it, but it really doesn't work. Guys are using PCT only for fertility. And that's actually part of harm reduction, because if a young man comes to you and his system is shut down and he knows he needs to live on testosterone for the rest of his life, however, hopefully a lower dose and something that's sustainable, he's going to be infertile. So we have to use these PCT drugs. But the concept is not to really bring back a sustainable function of the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis. It's just for a brief time so this man can allow him to enjoy and to have his own children. So that's about it, guys, for this presentation. I really hope you guys like the new kit. Stepping things up for you guys, because all I want to do is provide men in the world that are on androgens effective, ethical education to make sure that you guys make your own decisions. And if I were you and I'm a young man, I would either not do steroids at all, or if you did, you decide to do it, you really got to be careful, guys. And thanks again, guys, for interacting here with the comments, because you know that your comments are equally as important as my words for young men that are doing their education and considering steroids or suffering from steroids. To really see in your comments what you've done and what's happening to you. It is invaluable. And another resource that I've provided for you guys is my Anabolic Doc app. This is a digital men's health revolution for you guys, where you can have access to all my information. You could even get access to me on a live man-to-man Zoom, uncensored meetings where all these men come and they ask questions and everyone listens and hears. And in North America, labs, the exact same labs that I order for my patients, without a doctor's prescription, except for 3 states. We won't talk about those states. Hopefully we'll change this. And that's it, guys. It's all about really, really understanding education and harm reduction. Take care of yourselves, guys. I hate when I see guys coming to me years later after anabolics use and saying, Doc, if I really knew this, that I had to be on testosterone, or with the health consequences from the hair to the gyno to the prostate and the heart, of course, later, and the infertility and the sex issues, they wouldn't have done it. They would have maybe tried skateboarding more. But I really love the brotherhood. I love the Iron Brotherhood, guys, because I'm in the trenches with you guys, and I'm a leader. And I want to make sure you guys really move forward and understand what's going on here from a health standpoint. Thank you so much, gentlemen.